Princeton. I'm going to be talking about dignity and denigration in economic life. These remarks are based on a talk I gave for the 2023 presidential address for the Eastern Sociological Society. And so let's just get started. So I want you to imagine that you receive a phone call that your 73-year-old father has been taken to jail. And he's been taken to jail while your mother is in the hospital. And he's been taken to jail. Why? Because he owed a debt of $508. He was told by the court that he needed to pay this debt. And when the courts found out that he was paying tithes to his church, they indicated that if he can pay tithes to his church, then he can pay off this debt, and therefore they found him in contempt and they took him to jail. The daughter drove several hours to get to the courthouse where she had to pay all the fines, fees, plus the amount he owed in order to get him out. And this was in Boston. And these are contempt citations. They are rare in debt collection cases. It is noted, especially if the debtor is elderly. But no one really knows how rare they are because there are no official numbers on what's happening in our courts with debt collection cases. And one of the things that strikes me about this case and about many others, because we are now tracking what's happening with debt collection in our courts through our debt collection lab at Princeton, is that when we look at the case of Mr. O, one of the things that we expect is that the courts would have taken into account just his basic conditions. And so a philosopher, Anthony Appiah, notes that there's something called recognition respect, in which we treat people in ways that recognize some appropriate fact about them. And so you can imagine that if there's someone who has trouble hearing, we might speak more loudly. If there's someone who can't walk, we provide other assistance. And so we respect something about them, even if we don't rate them particularly highly. And this is different from Michelle Lamont's discussion of closing recognition gaps. Because the recognition gap is defined as disparities in worth and cultural membership between groups in society, and Lamont and collaborators are talking about how to close those gaps. And in this case, we're thinking that whether or not you have a gap does not prevent you from engaging in recognition respect. And so much of what we've been focusing on at the Debt Collection Lab and through the Dignity and Debt Network is trying to understand how members of communities recognize and transmit understandings of what it means to be valued or minimally competent member of a community. And they enact these standards and they have them recognized by significant others. We know that dignity has a number of positive and negative effects. And so in a study by Redelmeyer and others, they were just looking at whether or not, this is in the Lancet, how a hospital managed homeless patients who were coming into their emergency rooms. And at first, the assumption was that if you treat homeless people with respect and it's cold outside, they will just come into the emergency room and stay, costing the hospital more money. But in a randomized trial of respectful care, the authors found that in an experiment where half were randomized to the standard care treatment and the other half were randomized to the compassionate care or treatment with respect, because someone spoke to them and patiently asked how they were feeling and what they needed, the opposite happened. The initial visit lasted a little longer, but the homeless person didn't feel that they needed to keep coming back and didn't. I learned about this study from Eldar Shafir, a social psychologist who himself had experimented with the effects of reminding people about a time they were treated with respect. And they did this with people visiting a Trenton soup kitchen. And in the Hall, Zhao, and Shafir 2014 paper published in Psychological Science, the authors experimented with the control condition. Please describe a recent meal you've had, and then they were served their food. In the randomized treatment condition, they were asked to describe a moment that made them feel proud. On the way out of the soup kitchen, there was information on the table about how to take advantage of various social and economic benefits, and the people who had been affirmed in this experiment by being reminded of a time that made them feel proud were 3 times more likely to avail themselves of information that was on the table. But there are also some negative effects when we're looking at treating people with basic respect. Sometimes dignity is used to replace financial remuneration. And so in care work and elsewhere, instead of paying women based on the surplus value they generate, they are paid by the dignity they derive from their work. They care so deeply about the work that they do whatever it takes, sometimes using their own meager funds to help those in their care. Sometimes the pay is bad, along with the respect. And in a recent paper on gender dignity by Rosinho, Jaworski, and Quinlan, they found that women are significantly less likely than men to experience respect at work or to feel that they are treated fairly. Here's an image of a global meeting we had in 2019 just before the pandemic, the Dignity and Debt Network. There we were sort of thinking about the role that debt plays in a person's understanding of their self-esteem and their sense of self-mastery. And one thing to note is that if you are high socioeconomic status, your sense of self-esteem is protected. There's no significant effects of debt on your sense of self-esteem and mastery. If you're middle class and you have credit card debt, there seems to be a positive association. If you're lower class and you have student loan debt, there seems to be a positive association. What's going on? What we think is happening is that for those who are lower socioeconomic status, that student loan debt is an indication of investment in oneself. That positive association with self-esteem actually starts to diminish over time. So the longer you carry the debt, and when it's not going down anymore, because you're paying and the interest, etc., that association with self-esteem goes away. And so this was a moment in which we were bringing together a group of scholars. I'll just note that to the far left on the image is Tracy McMillan Cotton, who's written a lot about student debt. And the person beside her had just resigned from the Trump administration. He was the ombudsman for student loan debt, and he is now the general counsel for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Seth Frotman. And so we basically brought together as a way of demonstrating the power of economic sociology for some of the public issues at hand. We basically brought the publics to us, and according to Seth and others, if the sociologists had not got involved in the student loan debates in the U.S., we would have been having a very different policy debate and set of policy options than what we ended up with. That's just the image from the study on self-esteem by Rachel Dwyer and her colleagues. And now to denigration. I'm trying to go fairly quickly so that we both have time to have a discussion, but also to make up for a little bit of lost time. And I know how to do that, so don't worry, Andre. So we'll start with denigration. So to denigrate is to darken a person's character or reputation, denigare, through unfair critique, and denigrating someone is more aggressive than merely disparaging them, ranking their worth lower than it is, or diminishing its claimed qualities. Denigrating confrontations can be direct or indirect, face-to-face insults or overpowering dominance and humiliation, or rumors rendering another's reputation ruined or ruining. Now, I'm going to sort of think about this, how dignity and denigration works in the context of debt collection. Why debt collection? In the U.S., 1 in 4 Americans have had an account turned over to a debt collector. That's roughly 70 million adults. It's 1 in 3 for Americans of color. Similar to mass incarceration, the difference being that just because you have a debt turned over to a debt collector doesn't mean that they will necessarily hound you in some of the ways that they do. And what we also know is that when debt collection was envisioned as a supplement or a complement for credit scoring, so in a 1941 National Bureau of Economic Research report, one of the things that they noted is that you can either score better and figure out who's likely not to pay you back, or you can improve your collection techniques. And there's no judgment about sort of how to balance that. And what we also know is that if you have lower income, so if your incomes are under $20,000, it's 1 in 5 are contacted by a debt collector directly. If your income's greater than $70,000, number falls to 1 in 10. If you're taken to court for your debts, most of the time the defendant won't even show up for the court case. Sometimes they don't know that they're being sued until it's too late and a judgment's been rendered and their accounts have been seized. And if they do show up, less than 10% have legal representation. So this made it, for me, a great case of denigration in economic life. The other thing, too, to keep in mind is that even when the economy is not doing well, the debt collectors are fine. So during the shutdowns of 2020, the debt collectors were still filing court cases by the thousands, and their profits were up. When we look at hotspots, not surprisingly, where median income is low, where racial diversity is higher, we see more debt collection cases on our maps. And when we look at who's doing the suing, we see that there's a high concentration of a small group of actors basically overtaking the courts. This is referred to by some legal scholars as assembly line litigation. And so it relies on a model of having a high volume of cases that are low value. And by low value, we're talking about a $1,500, $1,800 lawsuits. But they do it at very high volume. So you'll have a single lawyer who will file over 10,000 debt collection cases in a year. Now, what makes the debt collection cases interesting is that in an interview with a former debt collector, what they noted was if you can shame someone enough, they will pay you before they purchase their medicine, and they will pay you before they pay their rent. And you're trying to grab their attention when their attention is being pulled by a number of different actors. And so they are well-schooled in denigration strategies. Now, when Goffman penned Stigma in 1963, he described how individuals attempt to perform their public identities in such a way as to be viewed favorably by a mainstream audience. And these stigmatized individuals were somehow characterized as having something to be ashamed of. The stigmata was on the body. By comparison, my discussion of dignity indicates that individuals have something to be proud of that is inherent to their personhood, but they only rely on the gaze of others, particularly the recognition from mainstream audiences. In my formulation, individuals are trying to accomplish dignity in resistance or in response to others who are attempting to denigrate them. Instead of managing stigma in the way that Goffman depicts it, these individuals are managing denigration. Drawing on Goffman's discussion of stigma management strategies, Jeffrey Alexander's concept of social performance, and Viviana Zeller's concept of relational work, I ask how individuals manage situations where their dignity has either come under threat or is likely to be assaulted. Alexander identifies a cultural structure that constrains an actor's performance and an audience's reaction to that performance, and Zelizer links the performing actor to other meaningful social ties and exchange media that influence which strategies and which media the actor will utilize to protect themselves from or launch counterattacks on their denigrating assailants. I begin with the well-known stigma management strategy of covering. It is also a strategy for denigration management. This strategy is one in which, to borrow from Hitland and Anderson, a given person may view their own life as dignified at the same time that an observer does not. And these oppressed persons in many cases enlist a variety of interactional strategies in an attempt to bring third-party apprehensions, understandings of themselves in line with their own self-views. The given person may try to gain the consent of their denigrator to delay, suspend, or cancel an announcement or display that would degrade the character, their own character. And we see this time and again in moments in which someone is trying to hide the fact that they owe money and can't pay it. And they're trying to practice discretion. Now, when debtors are trying to avoid having their shame performed for all to hear, as has happened a number of times when debt collectors are trying to contact them and try to do so in very public ways, one of the things that happens in the early 1900s, there's a description of a woman named Miss Sullivan, and she was called a baller out, and she would show up to a person's workplace and sing in a very loud voice to announce that they owed money that they weren't paying, and sometimes this would result in the person losing their job. The modern day equivalent is, and there have been lawsuits on this, the debt collector is contacting a person's workplace in a very public way, or contacting their child at school to deliver the message that they're trying to reach the parent but cannot. Under the current presidential administration, those cases are now being prosecuted, but for a long time that was done with impunity. Relational covering. Sometimes individuals are engaged in a covering strategy that looks anything but. It is because they are not covering for themselves, but for socially significant others. This strategy is one that I call relational covering. Unlike Goffman's notion of covering, in which an individual tries to hide the attribute that is externally deemed to be of low regard or repulsive, relational covering refers to how the individual is taking account of others. For the most part, when people are not covering for themselves, but for their children or other loved ones, at least one of two things can happen. First, they can deflect the denigrating blow away from socially significant others. This requires interactional work and relational work to make themselves the target for absorption. Second, they often absorb the denigration themselves, sacrificing themselves for others. The socially significant other can be covered without knowing it is happening, or can cooperate in the relational covering, often with gratitude and a high regard for being the person willing to engage in self-sacrifice. We see this when a parent may decide to take on debt obligations of their child. their retired parent, or someone else they are trying to protect. They may tell the debt collector, call me, not them. These actions will mean that the person the parent is protecting will look honorable, but the parent who is receiving all the debt collector's calls may not seem to be that honorable, because all others will know is that they are the target of collection. I remember in conversations with researchers in Federico Nyberg's group, they described situations where an extended family would select a single person who needs to remain creditworthy, and this single person would handle major credit-related responsibilities for the family circuit. In the event that the creditworthy member of the circuit would run into financial troubles, someone in the circuit will take on costly debts, sometimes through informal means, so that money could be transferred to the creditworthy member of the circuit who could remain clean. The problem is deflected away from that credited member and absorbed by more discreditable members of the circuit. Importantly, third parties sanction positively or negatively the transactions that people undertake, as well as those they fail to undertake. And these third parties can recognize and articulate the reasons why the target was unable to fulfill alleged obligations or to honor promises made. In this way, third parties can engender an environment in which individuals can bear themselves with dignity, even if their material circumstances remain dire. Acknowledgement strategies. Sometimes individuals try to manage denigration, as they do with stigma, by coming clean. Yes, I'm guilty as charged, but there were circumstances that explain why I did what I did. In May 2021, Massachusetts Representative Ayanna Pressley stepped onto the floor of the U.S. House to acknowledge that her own family had experienced denigrating debts. She placed blame on policymakers for pushing consumers to the edge, forcing millions to take on significant debts just to survive. Reflecting on her own family story, she explained, "Like many, my mother took pride in paying her bills and paying them on time. But after several life-disruptive events, the death of an immediate family member, a layoff, and a mandatory surgery, there came a point where she could no longer afford it. No matter how hard she worked, we owed everyone, the utility company, the landlord, the bank, and we were frequently harassed by debt collectors. Our story is the story of millions of families." Her mother did not deserve harassment when doing the best that she could. No mother did. The House mostly agreed along partisan lines. The bill passed, at least there, and was sent up to the Senate, where it rests. When engaging in and acknowledging the right way to do things, we're often engaged in trying to match the right kinds of funds to the right kinds of problems. And one of the things that we describe in Money Talks is an experiment in which two economists, Soman and An, describe what it means to renovate one's bathroom, and whether it's acceptable to break into their child's college fund, or whether for a very low interest loan that they paid back themselves, they're disciplined, or whether it makes more sense to take a higher cost, higher interest loan. And what they describe initially is a sense that there's this mental account that that's hard to break, and therefore they're not going to break into the child's college fund. What we say is that there's something else going on. Just like with child college funds for children, Christmas savings funds, this relies on relationships to keep those funds protected. And what Soman and An describe is a situation in which they didn't know how they would face their relatives and in-laws, and describe, oh, by the way, yes, the bathroom looks gorgeous, but yes, we did break into your grandchild's college fund. The relational pressures would be too great and not worth it. And so one of the things that we do there is we try to note the extent to which some of the things that we think are happening mentally are being enforced relationally. Deliberate mismatching. Just because we see a consumer initiating matches that look to be bad ones does not mean that they are doing so by mistake. Another important strategy for managing denigration, and my framework, is that of deliberate mismatches. While the strategies of covering, relational covering, and acknowledgement mean that the individual is trying to correspond or align to what they pay and how they pay in a harmonious way, this third strategy relies on rivalry and contrast, as the actor purposely brings together elements generating discord. While relational work presents actors trying to make good matches and severing or cooling ties when that is not possible, this kind of relational work allows actors to make bad matches and to keep those matches salient for the sake of their self-worth. And we often see this when consumers are making complaints to their advocates about being pressured to use monies that really should be used for their children to pay a bill. Rejecting the mainstream gaze. While strategies of covering and acknowledgement are meant to bring the views of outsiders in line with those of the person being assessed so that it is more positive, that is not the case for those who no longer allow that gaze to govern their lives. By isolating oneself and one's practices from the mainstream world and its gaze, or by abandoning arenas where the external judgments are one-sided and where denigration is deepened, a group can pursue avenues of exit. A group may create a more isolated world, what feels like a separate sphere, with its own justice norms. In this world, they no longer need to contextualize how and why denigration occurred in the ways that the denigrators find legible. The denigrators are not at the center of the story. Some debt strike movements have started to do just that. In the Chilean context, Felipe Gonzalez Lopez finds that the feelings of we-ness can emerge when over-indebtedness moves from being an individual failing that is suffered in shameful silence to being an externally generated condition by a common enemy. In his study of the student debt movement in Santiago, social movement actors challenged the existing moral frame of debt as a condition individuals brought onto themselves. "You are not alone," protesters chanted, LOAN, extolling the collective by way of a pun. The requirement that students in Chile have co-signers who were also responsible for paying down their debts made its burden more widespread and its injustice more intensely felt, according to work by Perez Roa and others. Large assemblies generated collective effervescence as debtors shared their burden, expressed righteous indignation at their wrongdoing, and shifted the blame for their condition onto a single identifiable culprit. These formations of group solidarity, Portes and Sensenbrenner remind us, can form important sources for social capital and new sources for dynamic growth. In the United States, the Debt Collective has engaged in direct action, organizing to cancel student debts, medical debts, payday loans, bail, credit card debt, but their redefinitions of the situation have not yet taken hold in the mainstream, and maybe they won't have to. This movement claims to have abolished more than $5 billion through their strikes and other direct actions, including some legal maneuvers, but their struggle continues. How might we see debt in a new way? And how might we see what the problem of debt really is? Is it really how much you owe? Or is it the kinds of treatments that are then allowed by virtue of the fact that you owe money? And so part of what the work I hope will do is change the way we understand why debt burdens are burdens at all. And with that, I think we are in good shape for time.
Questions? Fred. What do you think about the importance of the predictive models, statistics, algorithms to amplify the differences? In your example of the lady that was have endless payment for anyone, probably she will have higher taxes than the other one that stopped to pay anyone.
Yeah. So one of the challenges of the kinds of debts that we're talking about is the impossibility of exit for many of the debtors. And so one of the things that we don't actually know much about is what are the terms and conditions of people who are trying to get out of debt. We don't know a lot of the details there. So once someone goes to court, we would love to know how much difference there is between what they originally owed and what they end up repaying. A lot of the courts will have fields in their online databases, but the fields they're usually not filled in. So some of the data that you actually want is not being filled in by the court administrators, and it's in part because the data side and the administrative side for the courts is underfunded. So you have a very small team of people trying to do all the data. The other thing that we do know is, and this is from some interviews that we've done in some of the areas where we're tracking court cases, is that you'll have someone who will find out that they have been sued, and the moment they go to the ATM machine to withdraw money, and they're unable to withdraw anything. There's a freeze on the account, so they call this one woman. She said, "I called my bank. They told me that there was a lien on the account for $6,000." And this was based on a debt that they say was a $1,500 debt, something that they say she owed $1,500. As it turns out, she did not. She didn't know any of the money. But she was both threatened by the lawyers at the court and told, we'll cut it down by half if you settle today. And she decided to fight, which meant she had to come back to court twice more. Because of the delaying strategies of the debt collector. In this case, we see a kind of a happy outcome because the debt collector did not have any proof that she owed the money. And when asked to produce the proof, he delayed, and then when he finally couldn't produce the proof, she was released. But there's so many other people who don't fight and who don't know and who don't owe money, and they still get caught up in this particular cycle. And so this becomes really challenging because it's hard to get the data, and sometimes when you go to the place where the data is supposed to reside, it is not there. And so we are, thankfully, we are engaged in some work now where we're sort of gathering this. Other.
Thank you so much, Fred. It's a real privilege since I haven't had a chance to hear about this work for some time and missed the Eastern Sociological Society meetings this year. Shouldn't have, because it was your presidential year. But so further engagement, of course, and I know you're writing a book about it too. One question is about the strategies and whether you have some empirical evidence as to when those are used more or less, right? The other one is about strategies of the debt collectors. And mostly you focused on denigration, and you said, this like really illustrative quote from the former, you said, debt collector. I guess it's a different way in which they reflect upon their work to say shame, right? Denigration is key, but are there others? And just, I'm still formulating a question, but for sure this paper in Sociological Forum by Francesca Polletta and Zaibu Tufile, whom I also worked with, on the morality of certain debts, right? Also differentiates then at a third level, and that is what kind of debt is it? Medical, credit cards, etc. So just some thoughts, whatever you'd like to pick up. It's super interesting, and I don't know, this is tipping over.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the Polletta and Tufile, I certainly used them on the morality of some debts, and I used them when conducting some interviews with people, because I actually asked, was there anything that the debt collector did that you thought was good? Have you ever had a positive experience with a debt collector, and what was it? I'll give one sort of story, and then I'll sort of talk about how we're trying to do this more systematically. So there's a woman who notes that everything was fine until all the bills were more or less fine until her husband died in a car crash. And she made the mistake of trying to maintain the sort of consumption for the household so that the kids experience sort of minimal disruption and change until she could no longer do so. It was an interesting conversation. And she also pulled out a stack of letters from debt collectors from her purse, and she was like, I think this is from X, but I'm not sure because the debt's been sold, and so it's hard to know as the debts get sold and new fines and fees get added what you owe and why. But then when I asked her about the nice thing, she said, well, when the guy from the hospital calls me, he's nice. Because he says, I know you're trying, and I know that, just put on what you can, but we know that you're trying. And she goes, and they saved my life. She had cancer. They saved my life, and they know that I'm trying, and they treat me as if I'm a person who is doing the best I can. But there are others she noted who are just so disrespectful. Those were her words. And she said, I probably shouldn't say that, but they were so disrespectful. What did they do? They said, we're going to stop even trying to collect from you because you never meant to pay this anyway. And she said, they treat me as if I'm trying to engage in fraud, like I'm a thief, like I never meant to pay, and that's not who I am. Now, this problem of sort of treating someone as if that they're acting fraudulently is one that works to the benefit of debt collectors, because sometimes there's a debt that has dubious origins or maybe nearing the end of the statute of limitations for it to be collected on. But they will go into court and they will say, do you owe this money? And they will say, I do owe this money. And then their legal person, the legal aid or consumer advocate is they're saying, I'm about to pull out my hair because I told them, do not say that. Do not say you owe this money. They're like, no, I'm an honest person. I did take out a debt. It was for something that was legitimate for the kids or whatever. And I do owe the money. And so the problem with dignity and honor is that it's used to also entrap. And so one of the things that we are doing right now is through the NORC at University of Chicago, AmeriSpeak panel, we are engaging in a 2,000-person randomized survey about people's experiences and beliefs about debt and debt collection, and what they think is fair and unfair about how the courts respond to and treat people who are indebted. And so that survey is being filled right now. As of last week, we were at 1,300 respondents. We should be at 2,000 soon, and then we'll see what the results are. But that is to be continued. And there we will be able to look at variation by the type of debt, because people respond very differently to medical debt than to credit card debt. And even the consumer advocates, they'll say, oh, credit card debt, we don't really want to touch that one because people just think that's a person sort of spending flagrantly, but medical debt we can get movement on because you can't help it if you get sick. And so even when you respond and say, well, that that's really not why most people are in credit card debt. It's for everyday expenses, and there doesn't seem to be that much movement. And so there is a kind of a different moral weighting on debt by virtue of its perceived origins. Yes, now let's just collect a bunch of stuff. And I see there are two things in the chat, too.
Yeah, there's some questions.
Thank you. Very interesting also to see the limits of commensurability of dignity and money, which I think is very important to look at. And I'm also thinking about the work of Cardoso de Oliveira in Brazil, who does research on small claims courts in the United States. So maybe interesting to look at, because these small claims court are often disputes about $200, and the costs of the court case, and I'm not even talking about the energy, far outweighs the claims. So it's about something else. And I think very much the kind of issues that you're addressing, respectability, dignity, honor, all these kind of things. So I was just thinking about his research as a kind of extreme case, that if it's not about the money, then what is it about? So yes.
I need to find this person.
Yeah, I'll give you the right.
Please, thank you. The team.
It was wonderful, Fred. I have it. What happened with that? First, in your, I wonder if in your historical frame you are thinking about something like moral careers of the debtor. If you use this kind of reflection, the trajectory of the debtors. This is the first, and the second is next to this first is where came from the trajectories. Where came from the strategies? Where people learn these strategies in the family, in where is this learning processes of strategies to manage this situation?
No.
Thanks.
That's great. So yes to the thinking about moral careers of debt. So that is something that I'm thinking about, and also yes to some of the learning processes. So on the learning processes, one of the people that I think is useful for this discussion of learning processes, because of a recent paper on market socialization, is Adam Goldstein. So the Goldstein-McKnight paper just came out. Carly, is it McKnight? Just Knight. Okay. I keep turning her into a McKnight, but that's my issue. And Carly Knight. And so, and will you talk about market socialization today or no? Okay. So, sadly, we will not hear that much about market socialization today, but that becomes I think a really sort of important place for thinking about how do people sort of start to orient themselves toward these financial products and services. And some of the ways that happens, of course, is, and I'm borrowing from you, sorry, so I won't do them justice, but so one of the things that we note is that, and they note is, in the moment in which the retirement benefits, your employer sort of takes you off pensions and says, oh, now you're going to invest in 401ks. Well, that's not something you chose, but then you start paying more attention to the market, right? And there are other things that are happening where you're thinking about your home as an investment. And if you don't think of your home as an investment, all you have to do is turn on television, and there's a whole, series in which you see people saying, I made these small changes to my home, and now the value's way up. And so everything becomes about investment, and it becomes sort of, the people who are helping you do the investments are the angels. They're helping you sort of help your family. And so there are all these ways that you're sort of getting sort of pivoted towards a whole set of diverse products and services in the marketplace. And that's where you're starting to look and learn about what do you do when things are going right and what do you do when things are going wrong. The strategies that I sort of pull out are based on qualitative interviews, and so it's not meant to be exhaustive, and I can't say that these are representative of all the strategies or the most, and I can't tell you which ones are most prevalent. But I can say, in the interviews that we've done and read, these are strategies that we're finding. So that's kind of where that is, but more to come. More to come.
We have a question from the Zoom, and then if you can just go after.
Okay.
Hi, we have two questions from Juan Montezuma, who is watching us from Zoom. Juan's first question is, what is the role of religious morality in the behavior of debtors? I understand that this would require research, but I ask because it seems that the reactions of debtors to situations of coercion that they experience are part of a stigma towards poverty, very close to the characterization made by Protestant Christianity. And Juan's second question is, what is the incidence of the racial element in the composition of this group of individuals who are compelled to a situation of indebtedness? If you have this data, what is the percentage of African Americans in this group of debtors?
Yes. So the numbers do exist, but I can't on the racial compositions, but I can't pull it out of my head right now, and I blame that on the flight. But those numbers, some of those numbers that do exist. There are other numbers that don't exist on racial composition. And so one of the things that we've had to do is use names and addresses to impute race on for the court cases, because even in courts where they have fields for race, they don't fill them in some court districts. And so trying to figure out the incidents there has been more difficult. In some cases it's easier because if you can we can look at neighborhood census tracts and see that Black and Latinx neighborhoods are overperforming in debt collection cases, but we don't have the kind of data to kind of pin it down to the household level in the way that we want. But that may change given the existence of credit panel data. But that's also tricky. So everything that I'm saying is like we can kind of get there, but there's some problems. There's another component to this on religion. I'm in conversation with just this week. I was on the phone with a pastor who has his own beliefs about sort of how religion is being manipulated. And sort of how people are thinking about their responsibilities in debt relationships. I don't know how much other work is being done on religion and debt, other than there's another scholar, Devin Singh at Dartmouth, a religion scholar who studies religion and economic life. And we've had some conversations about, and with some others about sort of some of the original understandings of debt and constraints that should be placed on debt were in canon law, and some of those beliefs still they still make their way into public policy discussions, but separate from their any citations to sort of their origins in the church or canon law. The final thing I'll say on that is that if you know the U.S., you'll know that the state of Ohio is one in which it's called a purple state because it often votes for the presidential Republican, but sometimes it goes Democrat. It goes back and forth. And there you see a lot of where they've had some surprising legislative changes on restrictions on debt collection and restrictions on payday lending. There you saw coalitions of religious groups who were able to kind of push the legislative agenda around a notion of economic justice that was rooted in biblical text. So there is work being done, but I can't say that I know any kind of systematic approach on my side that can help address that.
Very quickly, thank you, Fred, for this amazing presentation. My question is on the debt collection industry. If you can elaborate a bit more, like, is it a segmented industry, or we have just one kind of business that addresses all kinds of debts, or there's some kind of specialization in the field?
Yeah, so you have sort of a couple of really big prominent debt buyers. They're really powerful and they're rich. They're profitable. The economy goes down, they're still making money. Actually, they make more. And they're sort of at the center of action. You also have the big banks and credit card companies, and they're trying to collect. And when they get in trouble with the state, they'll just sort of go onto the sidelines until there's a period of time in which they can't engage in that action. And once that period of time expires, they go right back to the same action. There's work ongoing right now to try to bring them back in line, but good luck. Good luck. One of the challenges, of course, is that those same banks will provide money to community-based organizations, and and some of those banks will win awards from the state, from the same regulators, for how they have made credit available in underserved communities, and they get awards for excellence for doing that. And so one of the things that we're doing, and this is why I'm sort of knee-deep into a book project on this, is trying to sort of figure out sort of how is it that we have these actors that, on their right hand, they look as if they're winning awards, and on their left hand, they're being sued by sort of embattled regulators. That some legislators are trying to put the regulators out of business because they're attacking the wrong financial institutions.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
I would suggest, due to time constraints, that we have a break. Extremely recent. Yeah.
Right, but the intellectual genesis of this was 6 years or something earlier.
As usual.
Yeah.
As usual.
Feels old.
Yeah. She's actually tracing the ownership of all the debt collectors in the database, and several of them were owned by the same. It's the concentration.
She's in high demand.
She's in high demand. She can do anything. She has a law degree.
Should I get started? Okay. All right, thanks. Enjoyed this conversation so far, and we can continue here. I know we're nearing the end, so I'll try to go into high energy mode. So, anyways, thanks, Andre, for organizing this and bringing us all together. I was going to present some work on quantification, which is also a big new direction in economic sociology, but decided to do something totally new. So this is, if you'll indulge me or bear with me, the first time this is seeing the light of day anywhere. In fact, I think we just got the beta version of the data put together about 2 weeks ago. So early stage work, looking forward to your comments and feedback and sort of helping us think through some of these ideas. And I guess I should say, given the topic of this workshop on new directions, several of the talks we've heard have really sort of started with a theoretical concept as a sort of new direction or a new way of reframing or rethinking of an old concept in some cases. And I don't know if this work is so much that, but I do think that climate change and the challenges it brings is obviously a new topical direction for economic sociology to take up. And I shouldn't say totally new. There are people who've been working on this for some time in some cases. But I think it's fair to say that this is overall a somewhat emergent issue in economic sociology or writ large. And I think one great thing is we have a lot of tools already that I think can be applied in productive ways to think about some of these issues, challenges, and puzzles. And so this is just one instance of that. Please don't think that this is sort of meant to set an agenda for economic sociologists working on decarbonization. It's really a much more humble intervention than that. So what we're doing here is essentially just to go ahead and give it away. Is thinking about the role of various kinds of organizational restructuring and specific kinds of, what we're thinking of as ecological relationships between different kinds of organizational populations as being key mechanisms in permitting or facilitating an evasion of accountability around decarbonization pressures, right? And I'll talk more about, sort of what that means. But I think that the title more or less describes the process that we're uncovering here, in which publicly traded corporations divest high carbon emitting assets without net reductions in carbon emissions. So just a few sort of waypoints, I guess we could think about is by way of background and also motivation. And I'm going to present these in a kind of bulleted form. We're still sort of thinking through the exact relationship between them, but this is really where I'm coming from with this. I'm not someone who's studied carbon emissions in general, but I've been very interested in various aspects of the sociology of finance and sociology of financialization. And so this obviously raises issues around the relationship of corporations to various kinds of stakeholders and the sort of arc of shareholder value capitalism more generally. And I think one process that, particularly in the U.S. economy, I think in the global North writ large, maybe global corporate fields writ large, is rising accountability demands faced by corporations. And these take a variety of forms. These are and often sort of contradictory kinds of demands that are placed upon organizations by various kinds of actors, whether they be political actors, publics, consumer audiences, that firms and frankly non-firm governmental entities exhibit various kinds of traits, right, that are deemed to be normative in various ways. So we can think about this as demands that corporations respect human rights, or that they utilize environmentally sustainable practices, that they're socially accountable. This becomes institutionalized in various kinds of financial classifications, particularly around what's called ESG finance, economic, social, and governance kinds of ratings, scores that are then used to allocate money, and this plays a big role in the story we're going to tell here. So this is sort of a process that's sort of been theorized. I'm not the first person to notice this, but we're interested in sort of what are the consequences of that. There have been a lot of debates about the extent to which this is all just illusory, classic smoke and mirrors, particularly ESG, or whether it actually holds any promise to alter behaviors. And we're going to sort of show you a sort of nuanced answer to that question, I think. A second sort of point of background to all of this is at the same time that public-facing organizations and corporations, those that, say, have a high sort of reputational stake and reputational liabilities that they must manage, at the same time, that process has been occurring. There's been this huge expansion of private equity throughout the U.S. economy. And private equity, by that I mean firms that are owned by private equity investors. And the nature of private ownership, compared to sort of publicly traded firms, is one in which there is much less public accountability, right? There is much less transparency. There's much less regulatory reporting. So these firms are much more opaque in various ways. They are not subject to the same kinds of pressures to be accountable. In fact, they're often have very little identity or prominence. They're often hiding in plain sight. And this creates various kinds of affordances. And we're going to get into what some of those are. And this sort of raises a third point here that's something that's been of interest to me in other kinds of, with respect to other kinds of outcomes, sort of the general kinds of strategies and mechanisms of accountability avoidance amid what I think we can think of as a broader set of failures of private market regulation. So many domains of institutional life have turned towards various kinds of private regulation via market discipline as a mechanism to try to reduce costs, increase quality, police behavior in various sorts of ways. I've studied this in the context of U.S. higher education and the strategies used by for-profit colleges to avoid, to sort of circumvent the reputational consequences of their bad behavior and poor treatment of students. We're currently studying similar processes in healthcare. And so I think this is a sort of broader set of issues that I think can animate a lot of that can animate some economic sociology around questions of accountability avoidance. And so this research is speaking to that broader agenda. Okay, that's all kind of abstract. Just start with an example, I think, to highlight sort of how we're thinking about the role of these accountability pressures, and what do I really mean by that, in spurring various kinds of corporate behaviors. So this is a quote from a CEO of an energy company that's divesting a carbon-emitting asset, in this case a generating plant, electricity generating plant. So this is sort of the CEO describing why they did this, as well as helping to reduce Dominion Energy's overall business risk profile. It would give the company a clear path to net zero by 2050. And that, in turn, would help the company target prospective shareholders for whom ESG-related factors are playing an increasingly prominent role in investment decisions. So, again, there's a lot of debate about shall we say, hollow promises of ESG. But I'm not suggesting otherwise, but I think it is notable that this language is actually very prominent, right? That this is a justificatory kind of pressure that CEOs use to explain a lot of behavior around all sorts of different corporate practices. Another example, in a very similar vein, one that's very close to home for those of us in central New Jersey, our public utility, the regulated utility that serves us in Princeton, New Jersey, PSE&G, is a publicly traded firm, but one that has a very sort of public profile in the sense that, right, it's very visible to consumers. It's subject to lots of claims by politicians. And so they also have embarked on a very sort of publicly touted decarbonization project. The Public Service Enterprise Group announced Thursday that it has agreed to sell its fleet of 13 fossil fuel plants for approximately $1.92 billion to a Boston-based private equity company focused on energy infrastructure investments. A year ago, this is then the CEO, a year ago we announced the strategic review of PSE&G's generating assets in line with our long-term focus on improving our business mix and enhancing an already compelling environmental, social, and governance profile, said Ralph Izzo, chairman and CEO. And you see they get this newspaper coverage to great acclaim about selling off fossil fuel plants. So what actually happens to these plants when they're sold by publicly traded firms? Well, if you track these plants that PSE&G divested, 2 years later, the two coal plants in particular, which which are actually located in Pennsylvania, were each still in operation, and they were each still top carbon-emitting facilities in the United States. Right. So what's going on here? Well, emissions are being outsourced into the supply chain, and they're being bought or transferred to nameless, unknown private firms whose structures allow them to basically fly under the radar and avoid reputational pressures. And so the result, again, is of this sort of very simple dynamic of this relationship between publicly traded firms and private equity ones, in this case, is that we do see very real corporate divestiture of fossil fuel assets, but without any consequent reductions in carbon emissions. And so if we think about a theoretical frame to try to illuminate this a little bit, concept that I find very useful here is a familiar one of institutional decoupling. But what we can actually think of as two rather different flavors of institutional decoupling. And decoupling is all about evading enactments of various kinds of normative or in some cases coercively prescribed kinds of practices. And so the traditional version of this is what's sort of famously thought of as policy practice decoupling, where firms might loudly proclaim that they're publicly proclaim that they are adopting a certain kind of practice, but in reality, it's only on paper, right? There's no real enactment of the practices in day-to-day work. And so the sort of in the case of environmental behaviors, greenwashing is really sort of the classic instance of this, right? So British Petroleum, rebrands to Beyond Petroleum without actually very much change in what they're doing, right? It's marketing, it's smoke and mirrors. And in that case, right, liabilities from the external environment are internalized, right? And it's within the firm that this decoupling occurs. And I think that's really a key thing here. What we're observing is actually quite different in a few ways. One, it's not about internalization of liabilities. It's about the externalization or outsourcing of the liabilities. And we can think about this as means-ends decoupling. And this comes from a very nice piece by Bromley and Powell. Powell, of course, being one of the authors associated with the original version. And part of the backdrop to this is a sense in which many of these same kinds of accountability and transparency pressures make it more and more difficult to get away with the old kind of decoupling. I mean, BP was roundly mocked. I mean, this rebranding spawned a billion memes, right? And so there's other ways of dealing with these kinds of liabilities that actually reduce the sort of reputational risks even more, and these involve externalizing it. Part of the reason this is a means-ends decoupling, though, is that the practice is actually not what's decoupled. In these cases, it's not that ESG is not working to alter corporate behavior here because they're just doing it on paper. No, they really are divesting the fossil fuel assets. It's real. The behavioral response by the targeted organization is quite real, and yet it's decoupled from its purported ends. And so I think that's a key distinction here, and sort of prompts us to think about these kinds of processes a little bit differently. Journalists, by the way, are onto this, documenting similar things that we're focused on here, and I think in some ways we're just doing it in a slightly more systematic manner. But you can see the New York Times is onto precisely this same kind of mechanism. So we're going to develop a few hypotheses about sort of, okay, if this story I've just told you is true, what might that imply sort of in a more empirically observable, systematic data set about what we would then observe. So we're going to develop a couple, if we sort of break this story apart a little bit into its component pieces, we can develop some hypotheses. So the first concerns what we're calling the carbon shift, that is the reallocation of carbon emissions from publicly traded firms to privately owned private equity firms. And we're sort of thinking about this as an organizational ecology of dirty work, right? Private equity firms firms owned by private equity are very well suited to perform dirty work in a high accountability environment, right? Precisely because they don't suffer the reputational liabilities of performing this work. So we expect to see a growing compositional reallocation of emissions from public firms to private ones. And we expect that this will occur both sort of in the aggregate as well as within industries. The second hypothesis we develop is what we're sort of thinking about as a paradox of market accountability. And this really concerns the correlates of divestiture or going private. Which kinds of assets are privatized? And the logic here is that if emission-related liabilities are a cause of facility divestitures, then going private events should be concentrated disproportionately among higher emission facilities. Hence, we expect that public firms will be most likely to divest the higher emission facilities, and they will be more likely to divest facilities when the firms, at the firm level, when those firms face stronger reputational or ESG pressures. Just by way of sort of preview here, we really are just going to be testing the first part of this hypothesis, given the data we have at this point. And we're not going to be getting great causal identification on it, but we can see at least the correlational implication of the process. And the third concerns the consequences of this, right? So what happens to these facilities or plants or assets once they're transferred into the low visibility parts of the economy? And so we can think about this as a sort of arbitrage of sorts. So when a facility goes private, either because it was divested by a public firm or just because the owner as a whole went private, we will see lesser reductions and or greater increases in emissions compared to similar facilities that stay publicly traded. And just to be clear, when I use the word public here, I mean these are private firms that are publicly traded private firms. I realize that's a little bit syntactically ambiguous here. So, what do we see on with respect to the first hypothesis? Well, let me just talk about the data. Where are we? Yeah. So this is just looking at the data as a whole. We're going to be using data from the Environmental Protection Agency Greenhouse Gas Reporting Data Set. This is data set that covers, in our sample, about 9,000 individual plants or facilities, factories, power plants, et cetera. So that's sort of the unit of analysis here, and then we're matching those to their owners over time, over a 10-year period from 2011 through 2020. And then we can look at sort of how these, how their annual emissions change over time. One thing you will notice is that over time, this time period, there has been a slow reduction in overall emissions, but as we'll see, that's quite uneven. And this data set as a whole accounts for about half of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. It obviously isn't capturing certain kinds of greenhouse gas emissions like those associated with transportation or something, because these are only stationary kinds of facilities. And my co-author did an incredible amount of data cleaning and matching using both manual and algorithmic techniques to match these facilities with the owners. So kudos to my co-author for the heroic work there. So what are the results look like? Well, with respect to the first hypothesis, at the facility level, we see an increase over time in these going private kinds of events. More and more of these high emission facilities are being transferred from publicly traded firms to private ownership. And not surprisingly, that's associated with a very pronounced compositional shift in where the kinds of ownership structures from which overall emissions are coming. So particularly you see that from 2016 up to 2019, the amount of emissions from privately owned facilities increases while that from publics continues to decline. Now, because of the scaling of the y-axis, it doesn't look terribly dramatic here, but when you render it in relative terms, right, where we use 2011 as a baseline starting point, you see that the shift is much more pronounced and dramatic here. So this is a 60% increase in direct CO2 equivalent emissions from privately owned facilities. So we think that there's good evidence with respect to our first hypothesis. What about with respect to the determinants of going private? To test this, we use discrete time event history models. My co-author did this part of the analysis, but this is basically a standard approach to study the correlates of various kinds of events happening over time. And what we find is that the facilities that are at relatively higher risk of going private are, in fact, the most highly polluting facilities, but the most highly polluting facilities belonging in particular to the lower polluting public owners, publicly traded owners, and those whose emissions have been increasing. So we think that's consistent. It's still a little unclear, but we think that that's consistent with a process in which those publicly traded firms that want to avoid any negative ramifications to their sort of ESG or reputational profile, culling off their highest emission kinds of assets in a very selective manner, right? This is not a random process of just old plants or those that are necessarily small or something being divested. It seems to be actually quite systematic. And so if we just sort of look at those plots, these are survival plots, and so the likelihood of the more steeply downward the lines are trending, that's the higher risk of going private. And so those that are at the firm level, we see that actually it's I'm sorry, we scrambled this graph a little bit. At the firm level, low emission firms that have lower emissions overall have lower rates of going private, and it's the opposite at the facility level. We also estimated sort of multivariate models that sort of show a similar story as what I already distilled here. I can talk more about these if people want. The third analysis for this is again about the consequences of facilities going private, right? To what extent do these factories or power plants that go private end up sort of having differential trajectories of emissions after the event compared to similar ones that remain publicly traded? And part of the reason we would expect that they might is there's a reduction in investments in say things like scrubbing technologies to reduce certain kinds of emissions, or reductions in investments in efficiency, and so these are the kinds of assets that can just sort of pump out as much carbon as possible with relatively reckless abandon because there's fewer consequences. And to test this, we use matched difference in difference approach. So basically, we take all those entities, facilities that go private, and we use a nearest neighbor matching algorithm to find publicly traded or assets that remain publicly traded that had a very similar kind of trajectory of emissions during the prior years. And then we match these two samples together and then estimate a sort of standard difference in difference kind of equation here. And so it's kind of a mixed set of results here. The blue are the treated units, those that are going private, and the black line are those that remain publicly traded. And sorry. What we see here is actually some differential processes across different. We can think about these as industries. There's some sort of complexities around how we're defining these groups because we don't actually have direct industry codes. We have these regulatory codes that are used in the data set. So you can think about this as a quasi-industry. So I'm going to use the word industry loosely here. But for electricity generation, those plants that go private actually end up, their emissions actually seem to increase at a slightly lower trajectory, though it's not statistically different. This is the top left, which is the opposite of what we expected. And the same for what's called stationary combustion. These are usually compressor plants and non-electricity generating kinds of combustion plants. Some entities like steel mills might fall into this, where there's some sort of large combustion process occurring that's not used to produce electricity. So it's a kind of aggregate group. But again, we see a lower trajectory there. It's the opposite with mining, oil, and gas. In fact, there's plenty. We did some variations on these specifications where you actually see that the facilities that go private actually, do have statistically greater upward trajectories following the going private event compared to the matched sample. Although in this version, it's not a statistically significant difference. That's in the upper right corner. Same with this, again, kind of catch-all group called mandatory reporters. These are certain kinds of facilities that have to report regardless of how much emissions they actually have. And in waste management, we again see a similar process where going private is truly a mechanism, it appears, to avoid sort of investments in sustainability and efficiency, environmental efficiency kinds of practices following the ownership transition. So I think that, to summarize this, it's a somewhat more complicated story than our hypothesis initially suggested, and I think one that's going to actually require some further study to unravel. But there are certainly subsectors where it's the dynamic clearly fits the hypothesis we suggest, and others where it doesn't, and why that is, we still haven't figured that out. So, again, these are, this is a first cut of some empirical findings, and based on these sort of, shall we say, thin findings, I'm going to probably draw some overly ambitious theoretical implications. And so, one thing to think about here, and I think we're on firm ground with this one, is this concept of fissuring, right? Firms fragmenting themselves apart, particularly with respect to the liabilities for labor, right? For employing labor, has really driven a lot of corporate restructuring among large firms, particularly in the United States, over the latter part of the 20th century. And this was really driven largely by an effort to reduce the kinds of liabilities that firms faced for pensions, retirement, following labor practice standards, and reducing, and just wage demands more generally. And so that led to this huge restructuring of production that is very familiar to everyone in this room. And we want to suggest that, carbon liability, may be a sort of potentially an engine of a similar process in the 21st century. So if we sort of think about this picture on the bottom right and the sort of privatization of carbon-emitting assets as being something of an analog to labor externalization. I think, one analytic implication this kind of way of thinking about it also raises is that we need to move beyond thinking about just sort of firm-level outcomes in our regulatory paradigms and our organizational theories, and in the case of public attention. And we need to also think about sort of the movement of these assets, these carbon-emitting assets. Just because a large publicly traded firm stops doing something doesn't mean that the activity has ceased. It may have just been relocated to a different kind of organization that's less visible. I think a second set of sort of broader implications we should think about is that I think we're playing around with this idea of the paradox of high accountability. And what we mean by that is that all of these sort of increased demands for transparency, for social and environmental sort of sensitivities of various sorts on firms actually heightens the importance of obfuscation, evasion, and invisibility in contemporary capitalism. We can think it actually creates a niche for doing, for performing various kinds of not normatively sanctioned kinds of tasks, right? What we're calling the dirty work. And so that leads to sort of two-faced kinds of organizational behaviors, right? Sometimes this occurs through subsidiaries of various sorts, but it also can occur through these kinds of full externalization kinds of maneuvers. And it creates, new kinds of segmentation and organizational niches. And then lastly, I think it, points to this alternative critique of ESG as being ineffective, not because it doesn't necessarily prompt the kinds of responses it's supposed to, but because it actually prompts not only those responses, but another secondary series of responses that are oriented towards circumventing the ends that ESG aims to achieve. And then I think there's a series of sort of larger issues about contemporary finance capitalism and the sort of in firm ownership structures in that story. And the way this is sort of often told, at least in mainstream U.S. sort of economic sociology of the corporation, is to think about publicly traded corporations and these sort of reemergent private equity kinds of structures is really alternative kind of competing models. And I think what our case suggests is that we need actually more of a theory of a symbiotic relationship between corporate and private capital. And this is just one instance of that. I think we can, perhaps think of others. But, and that, PE sort of is particularly well suited to performing certain kinds of work. And this kind of, we want to suggest that it's especially well suited to performing this kind of dirty work. Okay, that's it. Not much of a real rousing conclusion, but that's where we are with this work. Thanks for your comments.
Thank you so much, Adam. Really, really stimulating. And I do think it's very important that we added the substantive new directions, including those related to climate, to our repertoire of new directions in economic sociology. So great, and I hope you're doing more of that moving forward. I was intrigued by this concept, by the two flavors of decoupling, and I think you pointed very well how your work on disinvestment but not decarbonization is an example of means ends decoupling. And I just was curious, what are some of the other instances of, like theoretical or empirical probably examples of that? Because I know your work is so wide-ranging too, and I don't know whether in what you've done already you could pinpoint some cases, or if potentially this is something you've been thinking would pertain to other research.
Yeah. Well, so just to be clear, that's not our term. That's yeah. Okay. Oh, you've read the. Okay. Yeah. So it's a great question. One of the points they make in this paper is that actually quantification and accountability, right, the sort of emphasis on measurement and metrics in organizational life, really lends itself to means-ends decoupling. Once you have to measure something, you kind of have to. It's harder to just avoid doing it altogether. But this measurement often takes on a life of its own, and so they want to suggest that many of our sort of quantification projects are complete instances of means-ends decoupling. They give these are scholars who study nonprofits. In much of their empirical work, they give this great example of an NGO that is focused on literacy and educational development in poor countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But for their donors, they really wanted to be able to show, put numbers on how many books were being distributed. And so they went to great effort to sort of develop these statistics for a nice fancy report. And then they went and sort of visited the sites and realized that a lot of these books, because there was concern that they would, that if they were just sort of put out and made available, that they would be taken. So they were kept locked up, and no one was reading them. Right, and so, right. So exactly. So that the emphasis. So they were doing the distribution of the books, right? That wasn't decoupled. The practice was very real, and yet it was and they were doing the measurement of it, right? The metrification was real. They were going to great effort to really capture their impact through these kinds of metrics, and yet it was completely disconnected from what was actually happening on the ground. That's another example where I think or another kind of site where we see a lot of this. And I think our case is kind of connected to that too, insofar as it's related to these kinds of ESG metrics, right? Or it's being driven by sort of the need to game those kinds of metrics. Yeah, Ben actually studies this, or related issues. Yeah.
No, it'll dovetail well with what I'm about to talk about. But I have a more kind of like factual question, which is you presented results for firm or kind of like sub-industry, or I don't know if you call it separate industry sectors, but
they're called subparts under the regulation.
Okay, subparts.
Yeah, but sectors or something.
But have you calculated, or is it possible to calculate the overall effect of this in the universe that you're looking at? So, is the overall effect more or less emissions if you combine both the factors of selling out to private equity and more stringent ESG regulations or internal rules?
So the overall trajectory, it is important to acknowledge, is downward here. I mean, if we look at the aggregate, so this is all occurring amid a admittedly sort of slow downward trend, so in that sense, we're that's sort of the context. The implication of the hypothesis is that that trend would be even more steeply downward were it not for these kinds of mechanisms. And what we end up finding, again, is a slightly more mixed picture.
So where are you going forward? You just want to rerun the tests, or with data? You said beta version.
Well, we haven't actually linked these ESG scores at the firm level yet. So this hypothesis, we're sort of this is not really well tested yet. We're also trying to think about better ways to get some causal identification on this. There's lots of reasons, right, why plants are divested, why divestitures occur, or why going private events might occur, and to what extent can we really say that trying to shed these high sort of carbon liability assets is sort of an operative reason.
And remind me again, the ESG scores, you're coding this from?
No, we're not coding. I mean, these are produced by these evaluation organizations, right? And that it's a big business. One of the attributes of ESG scores that actually makes them kind of, or many have suggested makes them quite weak as mechanisms of private regulation is there's a lot of internal incoherence among them, right? So different scores actually are produced by different evaluation organizations. They're not actually highly correlated with one another. And so that sort of creates a market a little bit akin to if we think about sort of markets for regulators, right? Firms select the regulator that's sort of most appealing. You can do the same with these scores. So we want to try to do that in a systematic way, but there's some issues with matching them to the facilities over time. It's just a data work project. Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
We are reconnected.
Oh, the karaoke got wild. Yeah.
Okay. So I was curious. So, would there be a way to connect this framework to shareholder value? Because I guess where I'm going with this is it's sort of like it's kind of interesting. Now we have public being on the stock market as it's not really a way of making money or thinking about a way to pleasing the shareholders. It's actually a mechanism of accountability as well, right? Which is very interesting. So from the private equity point of view, what's the dynamic that's driving this from the point of view of what's making these investments desirable? Or is it simply a way of kind of shedding costs and just kind of letting it play out? You see what I mean? This is not a super clear question, but I'm sort of curious, if you follow the money, right? I mean, what's happening here, at least,
How are the private equity firms making money off of this? No, it's a great question, and I think that's the answer to that question we think is going to explain some of these divergent patterns that we see here. So in the case of electricity generation, there are some plants that private equity firms buy, and they actually they don't make them any more efficient, but they use them as what are called peak generation plants, which receive state subsidies to basically operate at a state of readiness, but not actual operation for these occasional moments of very high demand. So they get rid of the staff, shed all the fixed costs, and have very low kinds of fixed costs, and then get these capture these subsidies. That's one strategy. which might explain why there's a sort of diminished level of emissions in those cases. So, that's potentially one sort of strategy that's very specific to that asset class. I think in the case of mining oil and gas, I think that is an industry that looks much more consonant with the story we're telling, where, say, the costs of capping, say, gas or oil wells, right, so that they're not just sort of releasing all this methane, are sort of an extra ex post kind of cost, often once the asset itself is expended. Private equity, these firms that are owned by private firms face, fewer pressures to do that work, right? And so that's why, their emissions, go up, whereas for the ones that are remain held by publicly traded firms, they're under, greater pressures to make those additional investments that reduce the emissions. So I think that, the way I think you're onto a right point, which is that, like, we need a better theory about how value is being extracted, or if you don't like that language of how profits are being generated by private capital here, and that actually might help explain really sort of what's these otherwise these patterns of results that look a little puzzling with respect to our sort of blunt hypothesis. But that's a good way of framing it.
It's a factual question, and it's definitely not covered by your research here, but nonetheless. Is there any sort of, or could any sort of market-based activism be a factor driving these companies to sell these facilities? And if that is so, can that sort of activism get to the private equity groups, or?
I think that's precisely our part of our theory, is that no, it's very hard. There are ways of, having protest events, right? But there are fewer mechanisms for utilizing voice in these kinds of firms. That's part of the point of the structure. You can't go disrupt a shareholder meeting. You can't, pension funds can't sort of mobilize. Not that they're really necessarily the main actors here, anyways, in the sort of social movements, but there are just fewer avenues to engage in that kind of work. There's fewer sort of public sort of customer reputational kinds of costs, right? There's much less concern about bad PR. These firms, they're rarely public facing in very many ways. This. In this case, the assets were sold by a very prominent firm to one that no one's ever heard of. I looked it up. It's based in the John Hancock Tower in Boston. So it's a private equity firm.
They don't even mention the name there, right? No.
Right.
That's a tell.
Yeah. No one's heard of it anyways. Yeah. But I think that's precisely the point, is that it's this kind of market pressures that don't reach these firms very much. All right, it's late in the afternoon, I think. Thanks.
Yeah. And André encouraged me to share some of my brand new work as part of this conference. So that's a caveat that this is extremely new. I'll be making some maybe highfalutin arguments with very little data, since I've only begun data collection. But I'll be very happy to receive any feedback at this very early stage. And it's a great honor to be a part of this and back at USP, where I've met many incredible colleagues whose work has had a great influence on earlier work of mine that compared urban politics in Sao Paulo and Johannesburg in South Africa. And what I want to do here is present some theoretical ideas for how to approach the sociological study of climate change, and in particular, how to think about climate change as a central question of economic sociology. I've spent the past 2 weeks in Sao Paulo beginning field work for a new project in which I'm trying to understand how middle-income countries with legacy industries for manufacturing internal combustion engine vehicles are navigating a global industrial transition to electric vehicles. And this project is envisioned as a comparison between Brazil and South Africa. And at the end of this presentation, I'll present some very preliminary findings from my work in Brazil. But first, I want to make an argument, which is that to understand and analyze the problem of climate change, maybe even to solve the problem of climate change, we can understand it as a problem of industrial change. And this allows us to use well-tested tools that are at the heart of the sociological enterprise to conceptualize and understand efforts to mitigate climate change, which might otherwise present some fundamental problems for analysis, which I'll talk about in a second. So I've given you in broad brush a punchline, but let's first take a step back. When we talk about climate change as a problem, what are we talking about? At the most basic level, we're talking about how human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, 4/5 of which are from carbon, are making the planet unsustainable. And this is producing powerful global social transformations. Just to summarize 3 salient examples among many, climate change is revolutionizing patterns of migration, primarily within and across the global south, but also between the global south and global north. And this is due to direct effects of climate change, such as changing crop yields for those working in the agricultural sector, as well as due to indirect effects, and most notably a global rise in armed conflicts is increasingly associated with climate effects, such as changing rainfall patterns and reduced land area available for pastoral communities. But our imagination of the sociological effects of climate change should not only be rural. In fact, the explosion of climate-induced migration is ultimately an urban issue. The primary receiving area of these migrants are the urban informal settlements of the global south. 1 in 7 humans now lives in a slum, a share which population demographers suggest will continue to rise. And the consequence, or a consequence, is that global politics is being upended by climate change. The rise in xenophobia and racism as a structuring force in national politics is not only something shaping the rise of right-wing populism as a phenomenon of the global north, but it has fueled the rise of the authoritarian right in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, including here in Brazil. So those are the effects, the outcomes. We would do well to consider what is the problem that we're trying to solve when we talk about solving climate change. And when I use this language of problem solving, this may recall for some of you Monica Prasad's recent interventions in calling for a problem-solving sociology. And what does this mean? The way that I'm using it today is to argue that in order to understand how to solve climate change, we need at least 2 elements that Prasad emphasizes. First, to understand that the goal is to theorize processes of change, and second, to find some kind of comparative leverage in the logic of analysis to understand what is more or less likely to affect that process of change. So sociology can treat climate change in a few different ways. The predominant mode, at least in the mainstream of the discipline, has been largely to ignore it. And I'm not going to diagnose all the reasons for why that might be, but one recent study found that between 2015 and 2020, less than 5% of articles published in the American Sociological Review and American Journal of Sociology had climate change as a central concern. This is changing, but then there are still some questions about what the discipline should be doing if it isn't ignoring climate change. So sociology can focus on the effects of how to adapt to climate change, which essentially means treating climate change as an independent variable. Sociology can try to understand the social underpinnings of the problem, in essence treating climate change itself as a dependent variable. Or social science or sociology can theorize climate change as a meta-process of change that is reshaping all aspects of society. With this framing, an overriding research question becomes, how do we get from one energy basis of economic life to another? So what I'm exploring today is this last approach to treat the problem of climate change as an encompassing process of change in the energy basis of social life. But this presents difficulties for modern sociology because sociology, or modern sociology, is rooted in only one other such change, which is the emergence of modernity that birthed the modern social sciences. And the emergence of industrial modernity has a single basis in energy, which is fossil fuels, the proximate human cause of climate change. We might recall how Weber described the endpoint of what he called the modern economic order. This order, he wrote in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism, not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition, with irresistible force, and perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burnt. So, 120 years after he wrote those words, have we reached the end of this modern economic order? Seems like a fair question to at least pose, if not answer in the affirmative, at a gathering that's calling for new directions in economic sociology. So if this is the case, then we struggle to develop a comparative logic of analysis that might help us to solve climate change. What's the right comparison for understanding change in a mode of economic life that has had only one energy basis in molecules of carbon? This requires a bit of creativity. It means that we need to consider what climate change is a case of. I'm proposing that the problem of climate change is a case of switching the energy basis of social life. And as a result, I want to suggest that post-World War II experiences of so-called developmental catch-up are particularly useful for beginning to theorize how we get from one energy basis of economic life to another. Why are these cases useful? The structure of markets and politics and the problems of technology are all at least recognizable to our current situation today. These cases illustrate the difficulties and possibilities of changing the economic organization of a society in the context of increasingly integrated global markets, and the political competition between liberal democracy and authoritarian developmentalism structures the geopolitics of global markets both then and now. And the technologies that are most clearly implicated in carbon emissions were critical to the strategies of developmental technological upgrading for late developers in the late 20th or mid to late 20th century. Further, developmental catch-up as an object of social scientific inquiry in the mid 20th century was largely associated with macro-level theorizing of state and society, but the later post-World War II cases that I'll discuss in a moment enabled some key theoretical encounters between studies of development and the meso and micro-level emphases of economic sociology. So the best-known such cases are the authoritarian East Asian cases of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and more recently, China. Two key insights from economic sociology have been wielded to explain their dramatic leaps towards manufacturing at the technological frontier and generating higher incomes. In these cases, organizational dynamics, particularly high trust embedded social ties between business elites and key bureaucrats, helped facilitate a process of orienting business towards exports. Further, iterative processes of learning by doing helped corporations in these countries to move up the technological frontier to the point where these countries are now known for producing some of the most advanced technology on the planet. Okay, but these are authoritarian cases, and sociologists in a room like this might not feel so comfortable with just these cases. I know I don't, though I think they're very important. And what became increasingly important to many social scientists, actually as Nina talked about earlier today, was the importance of human capital in driving development. In fact, In the East Asian cases just mentioned, the role of high human capital was increasingly understood as a precondition for developmental success, but investing in welfare states came to be seen as an alternate approach to developmental catch-up, posed as an alternative to the East Asian cases. So in Kerala, a southern state in India that's larger than most countries in the world, strong links between organized labor and a political party of the left spurred increased investments in growing a welfare state, particularly in public health, which has allowed the state of Kerala to become one of the wealthiest and having among the highest human development indicators in India, essentially an upper middle income state in a lower middle income country. In Brazil, a similar alliance of organized labor and a political party of the left enabled the country to achieve strong growth rates and one of the most remarkable drops in income inequality during the height of global neoliberalism in the first decade of the 2000s. For those of you who were at dinner yesterday, there was some talk of the ABC strikes of the late 70s, and you can see a photo of Lula that was at one of those key strikes. So these democratic cases have suggested that meso-level dynamics of movements and public bureaucracies allow us to see how it's possible to construct strong welfare protections in contexts where more structural accounts of global capitalism would lead us to expect otherwise. Okay, so obviously all of these cases have the same energy source as their underpinnings, fossil fuels. But what can these cases mean for thinking about climate change as a meta-process of social change? What I mean by this is that social life in the Anthropocene, the period in which human activity changes the Earth's atmosphere, is leading to attempts to reshape economic orders in order to change the energy basis of social life. In rich countries in the global north, those who preceded late developers at the technological frontier are taking lessons from these late developers. For a while, the price mechanism predominated in public debate around climate policy, that is, to build markets for carbon. And beyond the political problems that emerged with instituting these policies, we've seen a growing recognition that purely market-based pricing is unlikely to produce technological switching points of the type required when technologies, where renewable technologies are not mature in terms of scale and availability. So the rise of green industrial policies in the United States and Europe aims to build ties between public bureaucracies and private corporations that can enable goal-oriented technological shifts. In the adoption of renewable energy production and electrifying transportation are where much of this effort has gone thus far. Now, rich countries are pursuing green industrial policies largely with no acknowledgement of two basic ironies. First, these industrial policies that they're now pursuing increasingly fell out of favor in the 20th century as rich countries pushed developing nations to open up their markets to global trade. And this coincided with increased divergence in incomes between poor and rich nations by the early 2000s. Now that rich countries are pursuing policies that protect and subsidize domestic markets to reshape the technological frontier, a big question mark remains whether they will once again, to take a phrase from Ha-Joon Chang, kick away the ladder for poorer countries to pursue similar strategies to move up global value chains. Second, the majority of the carbon currently warming the atmosphere beyond sustainable levels was emitted by rich countries, and their turn towards industrial policy carries little acknowledgement of the financial and moral implications of that historic legacy in trying to develop industries that can stop warming the atmosphere. And this image nicely shows the breakdown of historic emissions, all of which remain in the atmosphere right now. So poor and middle-income countries in the global south have learned different lessons. First, the established path to raising incomes relies on essentially growing emissions. And this is what the global south is doing. So much so that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions today come from these countries. And you can see that shift in this image. You can see which countries are changing in the emissions matrix globally. But for countries in the global south to switch their economic trajectories to emit less, they face barriers of both finance and technological know-how. So these are two barriers that the global north might be able to help with. In coal-dependent middle-income countries like South Africa, a group of rich countries have come together over the past 2 years to develop what are called just energy transition partnerships. These are designed to help recipient countries to wean themselves off of high-emitting energy sources like coal and to develop new green industries. So South Africa is the furthest along in terms of implementation of the 5 countries that have negotiated these agreements. The scale of finance is less than 1/10 of what's estimated to be South Africa's necessary funds for such a transition, and plans to wind down coal mines in the country are generating significant new pressure points of political anger, as the country's leading Business Weekly represented in a recent cover story. Brazil does not have such an agreement, but there's a very analogous kind of relationship that Brazil has with the global north around developmental financing to end deforestation in the Amazon. What's clear is that the political imperative in all countries is behind strategies that raise incomes. And usually that is meant to focus on growing economies, whether by emitting or not. And what rich country green industrial policies are doing is implying that growth and reducing emissions at the same time may be possible. And this is not a crazy proposition, as this figure shows, which was published last year in the Financial Times. The decoupling of emissions from growth is increasingly plausible, including, as you can see here, some middle-income countries in the global south. But sociology has never been a discipline obsessed with growth for growth's sake, and certainly it isn't today. Maybe it was actually at some points. In fact, it's inequality and not growth that has defined a central axis of the discipline's research on questions of both political and economic sociology. We want to know who is green growth for, that is, who receives the gains of such growth. We want to know who is shaping policy and firm strategy for green growth. We want to know who is doing the actual work of green growth, labor. And we want to know the political coalitions that sustain these models of growth. So I want to suggest that making climate change a more central concern of economic sociology can mean taking the micro and meso-level insights of organizations and socially embedded behavior in markets and use them to make sense of questions of development that have been associated more closely with the macro level of states and classes. While much of the work in sociology that has addressed climate change has focused on how climate change produces or reproduces a range of social inequalities, I want to propose that an economic sociology of climate change can also shed light on critical questions of industrial change. First, through a focus on how market relations are transformed when the goals of interacting in markets are not measured only by prices, but by emissions or technological outputs. Second, through a focus on how transformations of markets targeting green industrial change alters economic inequalities and is aimed at producing a form of social peace. So, for example, the United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has written and spoken about green industrial policy and its trade implications in the U.S. context as a foreign policy for the middle class, very explicitly oriented around this concept of a social peace in green industrial change. And third, by bringing meso-level tools of analysis to understand how social resources are mobilized for collective action in institutions. And further, we can bring these same tools of economic and organizational sociology to bear on our understanding of transnational dimensions of industrial change. And given the global inequalities of both growth and emissions, the Global South is a critical part of the world in which to analyze these issues. I'm happy to talk more about my selection of Brazil and South Africa for this broader project that I'm just beginning, but for now I want to move to present just a bit about what I found in Brazil that might help illustrate each of these potential lines of inquiry in an economic sociology of climate change. Okay, so Brazil is the largest auto manufacturer in South America, which over the past decade has produced between 2 million to 3.5 million cars per year, depending on the year, all by multinational companies. The role of markets in driving technological switching points today is subject to fierce contestation. And this is because of a somewhat unique set of conditions in Brazil, which has, over the past 30 years, developed quite widespread technology for mixing sugarcane-derived ethanol as fuel in internal combustion engine vehicles. In fact, 85% of vehicles in Brazil today use this mix of fuels. Across my interviews over the past 2 weeks with 14 firm executives, union leaders, and officials in the Ministry of Industrial Development, none of my informants saw a clear technological path between the poles of electric battery-based vehicles or ethanol fuel-based combustion engine vehicles. But in Europe and the United States, industrial policies now envision bans on sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. And in Brazil, this future is much less settled. And in a particularly illustrative comment, the key bureaucrat in the Ministry of Industrial Development, who one firm executive described to me as the mother of auto policy in Brazil, said the market will decide the technological priority. The return of Lula to the presidency this year has brought with it a renewed focus on industrial policy with a significant focus on the auto sector. And of course, Lula was himself an auto worker, as you saw in that picture from the late 70s. But the auto sector is not easily subject to state direction, as it is entirely controlled by multinational corporations. Decisions in Germany or the US or Japan, and increasingly in China, may have more to do with the technological direction of cars in Brazil than decisions in Brasilia. At the same time, there is an increased focus on industrial policy in Brazil, where the dominant sector in the composition of domestic growth is increasingly in agriculture. One byproduct is that this may favor a technological direction in cars that is potentially at odds with the global trend in the sector, favoring ethanol hybrids over battery electric vehicles. And then finally, the sector is subject to the entrance of new corporate actors from China. And I've just pasted here a screenshot from an article last week referring to a, quote, Chinese invasion in the auto sector. This was, in particular, was referring to the opening of a new factory for electric buses and cars outside of Sao Paulo. At the firm level, this is also producing an interesting set of micro-level dynamics as Chinese firms encounter long-time local actors in the auto sector. So I spoke to one executive who worked in a range of European and Japanese firms, who most recently served as the Brazilian liaison for the entrance of Great Wall Motors, a Chinese firm with a factory in the interior of Sao Paulo. And in describing his encounter with his colleagues from China, he said to me, they thought I was a Western barbarian. So there's just kind of this interpersonal encounter that's playing out at the firm level. And then institutional features of the auto sector are also being transformed. So to continue in talking about the entrance of Chinese firms in the sector, the world's largest electric vehicle maker, BYD, Build Your Dreams, has recently announced that it will take over an abandoned Ford factory in the state of Bahia. And this is consequential for a few reasons. First, it solidifies the changing geography of auto manufacturing within Brazil, increasingly decentered from its historic home in the state of Sao Paulo. And this particular deal of BYD in Bahia was reportedly enabled by negotiations between a delegation led by Lula to Beijing in May, during which time the governor of the state of Bahia agreed to a set of tax incentives with BYD in order for it to locate in that state. I spoke with an engineer and union representative with years of experience in the Ford factory where BYD plans to locate in Bahia, and he described a sprawling complex in which tens of different subcontractors and parts providers are all co-located. So this is a place where an increasingly divided and diffuse workplace is likely to prevail. And this presents challenges for the historic corporate-sponsored worker training institution that's part of the corporatist structure of governance in the industrial sector of the economy, in particular in Brazil, known by its initials in Portuguese as Senai. And a representative of Senai in Brasilia told me that they have yet to be able to develop training programs for workers that are specific to the electric vehicle supply chain. Okay, so these are very early reflections. I'm just kind of reporting some findings from things I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. So thank you for considering these very early reflections at the outset of a brand new project. I'll conclude by just summarizing two basic points that I believe this work might be able to help develop for thinking about new directions in economic sociology. First, we can conceptualize the problem of climate change as a problem of the energy basis of social life. And in doing so, we can orient an economic sociology of climate change towards understanding how the meso and micro level organization of economic life is shaping efforts to change the energy basis of social life. Thanks very much, and I'll leave it open for a little bit of discussion before people have to go to the airport.
Fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. One thing I kept wondering is you said that climate change is a problem of social change, and I take that point. But what would it mean to say that climate change is a problem of social reproduction? In a sense that at a more fundamental level, it's a question of capitalism or society not being able to reproduce itself. And I'm saying this because I'm coming from a processual approach, a type of Andrew Abbott approach where you have to explain social reproduction. You can't take it for granted. And usually it's difficult to pinpoint a case. But here you have a case where it's really interesting to think about climate change as, of course, it is a problem of social change, but at a more fundamental level, whether it's not a problem of social reproduction and actors trying to figure out how to reproduce this system that is breaking apart.
That's an interesting one. There's certainly at kind of the level of economic life, it's a problem of social reproduction where people there are many interests who would like to kind of figure out how to maintain as many parts of economic life as possible. One thing that I do want to push back against is I think climate change, at least in the popular imagination, in certain parts of the ideological spectrum, is presented as something that's presenting like an existential threat to humanity. And it is, in a certain sense it is, but that's not how I'm suggesting we leave that to the side, because the social fact of climate change is one that's driving big changes in politics, in industrial organization. I mean, in fact, the paper that Adam just presented is in a way reflective of how climate change is a social fact that's producing ESG ratings as something that firms care about and is behaving firm behavior. So yeah, I take the point, but I also just want to push back against the existential issue as being a way of thinking about an economic sociology of climate change, because there's kind of like more social fact components to climate change that are with us right now beyond the the whatever time scale it is of destruction due to carbon in the atmosphere.
Thanks, Ben, for this really wonderfully thought-provoking set of sort of early-stage results, but also sort of big ideas and ways of thinking about the problem. I guess a couple things. You're in a way talking about a sort of these imagined futures, and right of sort of, and particularly with respect to technologies and the settling of standards, and I think that raises a couple sets of issues. One is, that markets, one finding from economic sociology is that sort of standard setting as this sort of social process, it's actually very key to markets. And I think that one aspect that's actually being contested right now is what those will look like. And I think if there's one spot where maybe I sort of wonder if maybe there's a little overstatement of the contrast between global north and south is how well worked out this future is for the global north in the industrial policies. Yes, they're focused on batteries, that's sort of what in the present, but it's actually unclear how much, how widely that will go given these findings about the limited lithium sort of extractable, and whether there's really enough of it to really go all battery, and then there's these rear guard sort of politics by actors like Toyota and the petro firms who want to use hydrogen fuel cells, which can still be sort of reconciled with carbon economies, even though they're not internal combustion engines. And so I'm sort of wondering how you're thinking about that politics of competing technologies within the global north, and then the implications of that sort of uncertainty for the story you're telling about the global south.
I don't have a complete answer to that. I think that's it's a great point that this is certainly contested in the global north. What I think is different, and let me leave aside the global south as a category for at least a moment and just talk about Brazil, because I think what I've learned is that Brazil may be a bit of a unique case because of the ethanol technology. Which is that in the global north, we can say there are very powerful players that have, to a significant degree, though not completely, institutionalized the technological direction towards electric vehicles. But it's an important point that you're making, that it's not totally settled, and we shouldn't treat it as totally settled. In Brazil, there's no actor that I've encountered that is invested in the EV path. Even the ethanol-based path, it's the way that people talk about it is not that it should be wholly institutionalized, but that it's likely to be a critical part of the makeup of the car fleet in the foreseeable future, at least in the midterm future. And so to the degree that there are entrenched interests around a certain kind of technological imagination, the Brazilian case strikes me as quite different from what's going on in the key auto manufacturing regions, US, Europe, and China, and then Japan is a case that I would need to look more into, because particularly the automakers in Japan are they're pushing more on hybrids and hydrogen fuel cells and things like that.
Thank you for your presentation, very interesting. I have two questions. What did you find, if you could say more of, what did you find in Brazil, like from these political actors involved in proposing more space for those policies of green development, like the policies regarding the electric cars or the ethanol fuels, because there was a lot of disputes, and you said which political actors dispute over this kind of policy. So we saw in the first Lula governance a lot of dispute over if ethanol should have more or less subsidies, and what did you find about this kind of dispute over the policy to subsidize and give more force to these policies or not? And another thing that was stuck in my mind is how would you argue that like these case studies of the automotive sector is good case studies for thinking about the emissions, because how relevant would you say that changing these policies around cars would have a relevant impact in reducing the emissions? Because well, I don't know very much about this, but there are some numbers about how much emissions over the cars are in the production of the cars, and like the batteries, and you can say a little bit about how the emissions around like sugarcane production or producing the electricity to move the cars that are not using fossil fuels anymore. So how would you deal with that questions? Thank you.
Those are both great questions. So the first question, I'll just give two examples of the kinds of disputes around the kinds of actors that are involved in the disputes over the ethanol flex cars or the EV path. So the first is among firms. So I spoke to 3 different firm executives and a representative of the main entity that represents all of the established automakers in the country, which is known by its initials Anfavia. They each said something different about the role of ethanol. So basically it has nothing to do, for the firm makers, it has nothing to do with policies that are being set in Brazil. It all has to do with, or the way that they talk about it anyway, they say this is what our international headquarters is telling us. So General Motors internationally has set a goal that they're going to be all electric. I can't remember what the year is off the top of my head, but sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. And so that's the policy of GM Brazil. VW is not as set in that direction, but there's a lot of emphasis on that. So they're very interested in EVs. The head of Anfavia will take no position because he has to represent all of these different automakers, and that's the position that he takes to negotiations with the Ministry of Industrial Development. The other hand, when I spoke to a number of union representatives, they also take no position. But they also are very clear that the employment implications are much less scary in the short term if the ethanol-based fuels are part of the mix for a while until they can kind of catch up. But then, there's this question of, well, if you don't go fast, then do you ever get there? So anyway, that just gives a sense of some of the debates. And then I already described what the Ministry of Industrial Development is saying, which is we'll leave it to the market. So the firms don't know, the workers don't know, and the government doesn't know, or they don't have a firm position. Then how important are emissions from cars? So transport emissions account for about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But I'm not approaching this project as a way of saying, I don't actually have a position analytically on whether EVs are good or bad for climate change, in part because it's clearly contested when you look at the entire value chain, the emissions that are associated with the value chain. But also my concern here is how is climate change reshaping economic activity and political contestation over economic activity? And in that sense, that's what I mean when I'm talking about climate change as a social fact. This is a process of social change that might not even, in theory, it could result in more emissions. So I think we have to be open to all of those possibilities. What I'm concerned with is how are these actors contesting that future?
Thank you very much, Ben. It's just one factual question about the role of oil companies. Mm-hmm. So the question would be how to study these potential changes in automotive industry without considering the role of oil companies. Mostly in the case of Brazil, where Petrobras is, it's not just a company, but a major actor, political and economically.
It's a great point, and when I come back to do more field work, I'm going to have to investigate that. Because what was clear is, particularly in talking to auto workers, the unions, they said, well, we're the key labor actor, and the oil workers are the key actors, the petroleros. It's basically a monopoly in Brazil. That's definitely a critical actor, and I mean, in Brazilian politics, Petrobras has been at the center of Brazilian politics.
Also a factual question. The political polarization in Brazil also is expressed around the climate change, or there are some consensus in different parties of the polarizations?
You mean, are some people against acting to reduce emissions?
Okay.
Is that what you're saying?
No, I think there are a consensus in the Bolsonaro followers of Bolsonaro leaders, and also in the Partido Trabajadores leaders and followers around that the climate change is the future, and so all the economy and the society of Brazil was following this path of transformation. Or there are also a polarization around what Brazil had to do around this big change.
Definitely there's polarization, but there are two kinds of polarization. So first, or at least two kinds of polarization. The first is, Bolsonaro, he wasn't really a developmentalist. He wasn't posing development against climate change. When it came to the Amazon, he was posing this rhetoric of sovereignty against preserving the Amazon. But that mainly had to do with his alliance with agricultural interests in the Amazon region. But even in the Lula administration, there's an internal polarization, which is often it circulates around or it's polarized around development and climate change. So most recently, Lula himself and elements in his government have been pushing for new oil exploration, new oil deposits exploration on the edge of the Amazon. And then, some of the most important environmentalists in Brazilian history are in the Lula administration, particularly in the environmental ministry, who are very angry about all this. So the polarization of development versus climate change as a matter of national politics and on issues beyond just industrial development is critical. Though bringing in the oil sector perhaps links the auto industry to the question of the Amazon more broadly, but yeah, there are multiple types of polarization.
Do we have time for one more question from a Zoom participant?
We have another question from Juan Montezuma, who is watching from Zoom, and he asks, Professor, do you believe that the study of the globalization process in the 1990s can contribute to the delimitation of climate change as an object of economic sociology today? Listening to the presentation, I noticed that the reactions of the Global North and Global South in relation to the climate issue are based on the effort not only to ensure economic development, but also to find a stable position in the new international order, where the transformations in the productive forces and structures concern both the needs imposed by the climate issue and as for changes in the global production chain imposed by the globalization process at the end of the 20th century, especially in countries like Brazil.
I think I understand the question, and the globalization process by the end of the 20th century was kind of the quintessential kicking away the ladder moment, where basically it was freezing in place the technological distribution of labor across the value chain, and what I think is interesting about this moment and makes it worth studying processes of technological upgrading is that climate change is a key process that is scrambling or is producing a scramble for a new technological frontier. And it may be that it's the same order of countries that ends up aligned across that value chain, but it's certainly something that's much more open to contestation than it was, at the height of free trade globalization.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. I know that some people need to rush. Stay tuned, Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah.